I need to tell you about what happened to me in the Pacific Northwest Mountains, how I became the first scientist to successfully document Bigfoot's existence with irrefutable evidence, only to realize that sharing my discovery would be the worst mistake I could possibly make. What I documented in those mountains challenges everything we think we know about North American wildlife, human history, and the limits of scientific discovery. My name doesn't matter. What matters is that I used to be a respected academic. I held a tenure-track position at a decent university, published papers in peer-reviewed journals, taught enthusiastic students who actually showed up to my lectures. I had a comfortable life built on years of careful career management and academic networking. Then I made the mistake of mentioning my interest in cryptozoology during a department meeting. It started as an offhand comment during a discussion about research directions. Someone asked what unexplored topics might warrant investigation, and I mentioned the possibility of undiscovered primate species in remote wilderness areas. I cited the historical precedent of mountain gorillas, which weren't confirmed by Western science until 1902, despite centuries of local reports. I suggested that similar discoveries might still be possible in North America's vast forest networks. The room went silent. Then came the laughter, nervous at first, then openly mocking. Colleagues who had respected my work for years suddenly looked at me like I'd lost my mind. Within days, the story had spread through the department. The professor who believed in Bigfoot, the academic who'd gone off the deep end, whispered conversations that stopped when I entered the faculty lounge. My research proposal started getting rejected. Funding applications that should have been routine suddenly faced unexpected scrutiny. Students stopped signing up for my classes, warned away by advisors who questioned my scientific credibility. The dean suggested I might want to consider other career opportunities. The message was clear. My time at the university was ending. 6 months later, I was out. No renewal of my contract. No explanation beyond vague concerns about research direction and departmental needs. I dedicated 15 years to building that career, and it evaporated because I dared to suggest that maybe, just maybe, we hadn't discovered every large mammal species on Earth. So I made a decision that everyone told me was insane. I cashed out my retirement savings, liquidated everything I could sell, and invested it all in research equipment. High-end trail cameras, GPS units, camping gear rated for extended wilderness deployment. If the scientific community wouldn't take me seriously, I'd pursue this investigation independently. I'd find proof that would make them all regret their dismissiveness. I packed everything into a beat-up SUV that had seen better days but still ran reliably. The vehicle became my mobile research station filled with equipment cases and camping supplies. I drove west for 3 days straight, barely stopping except for gas and fast food. My destination was the Pacific Northwest, specifically the remote wilderness along the Washington-Oregon border, where reports of Bigfoot sightings had clustered for decades. That's how I ended up in a logging town so small it barely registered on most maps. The kind of place where everyone knows everyone, where strangers stand out immediately, where locals eye outsiders with deep suspicion. I found a rental cabin through a classified ad that promised privacy and forest access. The landlord met me at a gas station and led me up a winding gravel road to the property. The cabin was exactly what I needed. Old but solid, one main room with a kitchenette and a separate bedroom, drafty windows that probably leaked heat all winter. Most importantly, it sat right on the edge of the forest. Dense evergreen trees pressed close against the property line, creating a wall of green that extended for miles into the mountains. The landlord barely asked questions, just took my cash deposit and handed over the keys. He seemed relieved to have a tenant who didn't care about the isolation. I spent the first week transforming the cabin into a functional research station. I set up a workspace in the main room with detailed topographic maps of the surrounding area spread across a folding table. I marked elevation changes, water sources, game trails visible on satellite imagery. A charging station occupied one corner, keeping camera batteries ready for deployment. My laptop sat center stage, loaded with mapping software and databases for cataloging evidence. But before placing any equipment, I needed intelligence. Blind deployment would waste resources. I needed to know where Bigfoot activity had been reported, where local people had experienced unexplained phenomena, where the pattern suggested concentrated activity. The best source for that information would be the locals themselves. The town had one diner, a weathered establishment that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 1970s. Vinyl booths with duct tape seats, a long counter with fixed stools, fluorescent lighting that buzzed constantly. The coffee was strong and bitter, the food basic but edible. Most importantly, it served as the social hub where locals gathered to share news and gossip. I took a corner booth and made myself a regular fixture. Morning coffee, sometimes lunch, occasionally dinner when I didn't feel like cooking at the cabin. I kept to myself at first, just another face in the crowd. But small towns notice strangers, and after a few days, people started acknowledging my presence with nods and brief hellos. I'd positioned myself as harmless, unobtrusive, forgettable. An older logger with hands like weathered leather and a permanent squint from years of outdoor work finally struck up a conversation. He asked what brought me to the area, and I'd prepared my answer. Independent wildlife research, I told him, studying animal behavior patterns in remote forests, vague enough to be believable, specific enough to sound legitimate. He seemed satisfied with the explanation. Then he mentioned something that made me lean forward with interest. His logging crew had abandoned a worksite about 3 weeks earlier, he explained. They'd been cutting timber in a section of forest that had been sold for harvest, standard operations they'd done hundreds of times. But this site was different. Strange things kept happening that couldn't be explained by normal circumstances. Equipment kept getting sabotaged overnight. Chainsaws would be found scattered hundreds of yards from where they'd been stored, flung into the forest with enough force to dent the metal casings. Toolboxes got dumped out, wrenches and hammers strewn across the work site in patterns that looked almost deliberate. At first they blamed vandals or competitors trying to sabotage the operation, maybe environmental activists opposed to logging. But the security cameras they installed caught nothing. No vehicles approaching the site, no people on foot, just hours of empty footage showing the work area sitting undisturbed. Then morning would come and they'd find more destruction. Heavy machinery repositioned overnight. 50-ton log loaders moved several yards from where they'd been parked. The equipment showed no signs of being operated, no engine warmth, no disturbed fuel levels. Something with immense strength had physically moved them. The logger's voice dropped lower as he described what finally made them abandon the site completely. They'd started finding trees that had been destroyed in ways that made no sense. Massive evergreens with trunks 3 feet in diameter, twisted and broken at heights of 20 feet or more. Not storm damage. The splintered wood was fresh, the destruction recent. Not lightning strikes. There were no scorch marks or electrical damage patterns. The trees looked like they'd been grabbed and snapped by something incredibly strong. Limbs torn off and tossed aside like twigs. Bark stripped away in long gashes that looked almost like claw marks, but far too large for any bear. The damage concentrated in areas where the trees were densest, where visibility was limited, where something large could move without being easily spotted from the logging roads. The crew foreman made the decision to pull out after several workers reported hearing things in the forest at night. Deep, resonant calls that didn't match any known animal. Crashing sounds like something massive moving through the undergrowth, rocks being thrown from the tree line that would land near workers but never hit anyone directly. Warning shots, the logger suggested, something trying to drive them away without direct confrontation. I asked where exactly this site was located. The logger pulled out his phone and showed me satellite imagery, zooming in on a section of forest about 15 miles north of town. He traced the logging roads with his finger, marked the approximate area where the incidents had occurred. He warned me to be careful if I went up there. Whatever was in those woods didn't want humans around, and it had the strength to back up that message. The waitress had been listening to our conversation while refilling coffee cups at nearby tables. After the logger left, she approached my booth and lingered, clearly wanting to add something. I gestured to the opposite seat and she slid in, glancing around to make sure no one was paying attention. She told me about her cousin's dog, a big German shepherd that had been trained for protection. The cousin lived on a rural property that backed onto national forest land, and the dog had always loved running in the woods, chasing deer, and exploring. 3 months ago, the dog vanished, just didn't come back one evening after its usual patrol of the property boundaries. They'd searched for days, calling the dog's name, hiking through the forest with treats and favorite toys. They assumed the worst. Maybe a cougar had gotten it, or it had fallen into a ravine, or gotten caught in an illegal trap. The cousin had given up hope of ever seeing the animal again. Then, a week later, the dog showed up at a house miles away on the opposite side of the forest. The owners found it sitting on their porch one morning, whimpering and shaking. When they called the number on its tags, the cousin came to retrieve it. The dog was physically unharmed, no injuries, no signs of starvation or dehydration. But it was psychologically destroyed. The shepherd wouldn't go near the forest anymore. Even the sight of the tree line sent it into panic mode, whining and trying to hide. It refused to go outside after dark. The confident, protective dog had become terrified and traumatized by something it had encountered in those woods. The cousin ended up having to rehome the animal to family in town because it couldn't function on the rural property. The constant proximity to the forest kept triggering severe anxiety. Over the following weeks, I continued gathering stories. The gas station attendant warned me about specific valleys where hunters and hikers reported feeling an oppressive sense of being watched. He described it as predator awareness, that primal recognition that something dangerous is observing you. People would get halfway into certain areas and experience overwhelming urges to turn back, to leave, to get away from whatever was paying such close attention. Shadows moving between trees that didn't behave like normal wildlife. Too large, too deliberate, keeping pace with hikers but never revealing themselves clearly. Hunters who'd worked these forests for decades now refused to enter certain sections. They couldn't articulate why exactly, just that something felt fundamentally wrong in those areas. The wildlife seemed to avoid them too. Fewer deer tracks, less bird activity, and unnatural silence. A local hunter shared his most disturbing experience from 2 years earlier. He'd been tracking an elk and followed the blood trail into a steep valley. The elk had vanished, but he found its carcass 3 days later. Someone or something had dragged the animal's body up a nearly vertical mountainside and wedged it into branches 30 feet above the ground. The elk had to weigh at least 600 pounds. Carrying that mass vertically up a slope so steep he could barely climb it himself would be impossible for any human. No bear could accomplish it either. Bears can climb trees, but they can't carry heavy loads while doing so. Mountain lions drag prey into trees sometimes, but this elk was far too massive. Whatever had moved, it possessed strength that defied normal mammalian capabilities. An elderly resident who'd lived in the area his entire life shared a memory that had haunted him for over 50 years. He was just a child at the time, riding in his father's pickup truck at dawn. They were heading to town for supplies when something massive crossed the road directly ahead of them. His father had slammed on the brakes hard enough to lock the wheels. They'd sat there in stunned silence as a figure moved across the pavement. It walked upright on two legs with a natural, fluid gait. The body was covered in dark fur, matted and thick. The shoulders were impossibly broad, the arms long and heavily muscled. It had to be at least 8 feet tall, maybe more. The figure had turned to look at them briefly before disappearing into the tree line. The man remembered those eyes clearly even after all these years. Intelligent, aware, assessing the threat level of the vehicle and its occupants before deciding to continue across the road. His father had started the truck again and driven in silence. They'd never discussed what they'd seen, but they both knew. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't a person in costume. It was something else entirely. I documented everything meticulously: dates, locations, descriptions, names of witnesses who were willing to be recorded. I transferred the information into a database and began mapping the accounts geographically. Patterns emerged from the scattered data. Certain areas came up repeatedly. Specific valleys and ridgelines were encounters clustered with unusual frequency. The abandoned logging site appeared in multiple accounts. A section of forest near an old growth preserve showed similar concentration. Areas where the terrain created natural corridors and secluded pockets, away from roads and developed areas, places where something large and intelligent could exist while minimizing contact with human activity. I had my target areas. Now I needed to deploy equipment and start gathering actual evidence beyond anecdotal accounts. I'd invested most of my remaining savings in professional-grade trail cameras. Not the cheap consumer models sold at sporting goods stores, but research-quality units designed for serious wildlife monitoring. Weatherproof housings rated for extreme conditions, high-resolution sensors that captured clear images in low light, motion detection calibrated to minimize false triggers, night vision that illuminated subjects without visible flash. Each camera cost more than most people's monthly rent. But I couldn't afford to compromise on equipment quality. I started at the abandoned logging site. The access road had deteriorated in just the few weeks since the crew pulled out. Branches scraped against my vehicle as I drove in, weeds already reclaiming the gravel surface. The logging equipment sat exactly where workers had left it. Bulldozers and log loaders abandoned mid-operation, metal beginning to rust, seats filled with fallen pine needles. The whole place radiated wrongness. That's the only way I can describe it. An atmosphere of sudden abandonment, like everyone had fled simultaneously. I understood why the crew refused to return. Standing in that clearing with the forest pressing close on all sides, I felt the same oppressive sensation the gas station attendant had described. The certainty that something was watching from the shadows. I found the damaged trees the logger had mentioned. They were even more disturbing in person than his description suggested. Evergreens with trunks thick enough that 3 people couldn't join hands around them, snapped cleanly at heights of 20 feet or more. The breaks were fresh, sap still oozing from the splintered wood. The damage couldn't be more than a few weeks old. I examined the break patterns closely. These trees hadn't fallen from wind damage or been struck by lightning. They'd been twisted and pulled until the wood fibers gave way. Scoring marks in the bark suggested something with immense grip strength had grabbed the trunks and wrenched them sideways with enough force to cause catastrophic failure. I set up cameras focused on the damaged areas, positioning them to capture anything that might return to these locations. Then I followed the game trails leading away from the clearing into the denser forest. The trails showed heavy use. packed earth, broken vegetation, clear pathways through the undergrowth that animals followed repeatedly. Near a creek crossing, I found the footprints. My heart rate spiked when I first saw them. I knelt in the mud for a better look, pulling out my measuring tape with shaking hands. The prints measured 17.5 inches long and 7 inches wide at the ball. 5 distinct toe impressions pressed deep into the soft earth. The depth indicated something incredibly heavy, far heavier than any human. The gait pattern showed bipedal locomotion. These weren't bear prints. Bears leave claw marks and show 4-footed patterns unless briefly standing on hind legs. These tracks indicated something that walked upright naturally, consistently over significant distances. The stride length measured over 6 feet between steps, suggesting legs considerably longer than human proportions. I photographed the prints from multiple angles, placed a ruler for scale, took plaster casts that I could analyze later. Then I deployed cameras along the trail, covering it from different positions to capture anything that used this crossing. If whatever made these prints returned, I'd have documentation from multiple angles simultaneously. Deeper into the forest, I discovered structures that made me question everything I thought I understood about wildlife behavior. Branches weren't just broken, they were woven together in deliberate patterns. Multiple limbs twisted and bent into interlocking arrangements that created crude shelters or markers. These weren't random wind damage or natural tree falls. The construction showed clear intention and planning. Some structures formed archways over trails, creating covered passages through dense undergrowth. Others built lean-to shapes against rock faces, providing shelter from rain and wind. A few seemed purely territorial. Prominent markers visible from game trails, messages to other creatures that this area belonged to someone. I set up cameras focused on the structures, positioning them to monitor any activity around these sites. The construction suggested intelligence, tool use, architectural planning. Whatever built these wasn't operating on pure instinct. This was purposeful modification of the environment for specific functions. The sun dropped low as I finished placing the final cameras. Shadows lengthened across the forest floor, and the temperature fell noticeably. I marked my GPS coordinates carefully, ensuring I could find these cameras again in the vast wilderness. The hike back to my vehicle took over an hour, following my marked trail in the fading light. For the first week, I maintained a strict routine. Wake before dawn, drive to various camera locations, check memory cards and batteries, reposition units if needed, return to the cabin before dark to review footage, prepare equipment for the next day's deployment, update my documentation and maps. Night after night, the cameras showed normal wildlife, deer moving through the undergrowth, elk passing through clearings, black bears foraging for food. Everything behaved exactly as expected. No anomalies, no unusual activity, nothing that would support the local stories of something strange living in these mountains. Frustration built with each empty memory card. I'd invested everything in this investigation. My career, my savings, my reputation. Maybe the locals were just superstitious. Maybe I'd wasted years of preparation chasing folklore and campfire stories. But the footprints had been real. The structures had been real. The damaged trees had been real. Something was out there. I decided to push deeper into restricted territory. The old growth preserve remained largely unexplored, protected from logging and development for decades. If a large primate species was hiding in these mountains, the deepest wilderness would provide perfect refuge. Areas where human activity remained minimal, where thick forest canopy obscured satellite surveillance, where survival skills could sustain a population indefinitely. Week 2 brought the breakthrough that justified every sacrifice I'd made. I hiked to a remote valley I'd only reached once before, following a creek upstream into territory that probably saw human visitors once every few years at most. The trek took 3 hours of steady climbing, pushing through undergrowth, navigating fallen logs and rocky sections where the creek cascaded over stone formations. The cameras I placed in that valley had been recording for 9 days. I'd positioned them to cover a game trail intersection where multiple paths converged near a natural spring. Areas like that concentrate wildlife activity. Animals need water, and they develop preferred routes to reach it. If something large was moving through this territory regularly, these cameras would capture it. The first camera I checked was completely destroyed. My heart sank when I saw the damage. The housing was cracked open, pieces of plastic scattered on the ground. The lens had been shattered with enough force to pulverize the glass into powder. Most concerning, the memory card was missing, ripped directly from the internal socket with such violence that the mounting clips were broken. This wasn't weather damage or random animal interference. Bears investigate strange objects, but they bite and claw. This camera had been deliberately smashed by something that understood what it was looking at and wanted to destroy it. Something that knew to remove the memory card specifically. Thousands of dollars of equipment ruined. But I'd learned from years of fieldwork to deploy redundant coverage. I hurried to the adjacent camera, positioned 30 yards away at a different angle to cover the same general area. My hands shook as I powered it on and accessed the display screen. It had captured everything. I sat on a fallen log and reviewed the footage, barely breathing. The timestamp showed 2:47 a.m. 4 days earlier. The scene started with darkness, the trail barely visible in the infrared night vision, normal quiet forest at night. Then movement at the edge of the frame. A massive figure entered view, walking upright on 2 legs. This wasn't the awkward lumber of a bear standing on its hind legs. This was natural bipedal locomotion, fluid and confident. The Bigfoot moved with purpose, each step deliberate and controlled. A Bigfoot. The Sasquatch walked directly toward the destroyed camera, clearly aware of its presence. It stopped about 10 feet away and examined the device, tilting its head to study it from different angles. The Bigfoot's body language suggested curiosity mixed with recognition. This wasn't the first time the Bigfoot had encountered human technology. Then the Sasquatch reached up toward the camera. The proportions became clear as it extended its arms. The Bigfoot stood at least 8 feet tall, maybe closer to 9. Arms longer than human proportions, heavy with muscle. The hands were massive, fingers thick enough to crush the camera housing effortlessly. For one perfect moment, the Bigfoot's face filled the frame of the camera I was now holding. The image quality was extraordinary, high-resolution detail showing every feature clearly. Heavy brow ridge, casting shadows over deep-set eyes that reflected the infrared light. Broad, flat nose with wide nostrils. Face covered in dark fur, matted and thick, with visible patterns in how the hair grew. The expression was what struck me most powerfully. This wasn't an animal's blank stare. The Sasquatch showed intelligence in those eyes, awareness and calculation. It was assessing the camera, determining whether it posed a threat, deciding how to respond. Then the footage from the destroyed camera ended abruptly as the Bigfoot ripped it from its mounting and crushed it. I watched the sequence 5 times, unable to process the implications. This wasn't a hoax. I'd placed these cameras myself in a location no one else knew about. This wasn't someone in a costume. The proportions were wrong for human anatomy. The movement too natural for artificial enhancement. This was actual documentation of a Sasquatch, displaying intelligence and awareness of surveillance technology. The Bigfoot had known the cameras were there. It had deliberately destroyed one while the second camera captured its actions from a different angle. I couldn't determine if that was intentional oversight or calculated message, but either way, the implications were staggering. These creatures understood cause and effect, recognized human technology, and took active measures to control evidence of their existence. I saved the footage to multiple backup drives immediately, then returned to examine the destroyed camera location. Footprints surrounded the spot where the unit had been mounted to a tree trunk. I measured them carefully, 18 inches long, massive toe splays showing individual digit impressions. The depth indicated something weighing at least 500 pounds, possibly more. Hair samples caught on nearby branches where the Bigfoot had brushed against vegetation. The strands were long and coarse, dark brown to black, nothing like bear fur or elk hair. I sealed them in evidence bags, maintaining careful chain of custody in case future DNA analysis became possible. A strange, musky odor lingered in the area. I'd read accounts of Bigfoot encounters mentioning distinctive smells, usually dismissed as embellishment. But standing in that spot where the Sasquatch had stood days earlier, I recognized an unfamiliar scent. Pungent, organic, vaguely primate-like, but unlike any animal I'd encountered in years of fieldwork. I had evidence, real, tangible documentation that Sasquatch existed in these mountains. High-resolution video showing clear facial features, body proportions, movement patterns. Physical evidence including footprints, hair samples, environmental disturbance. Years of ridicule and career destruction were about to be vindicated. I could barely control the trembling in my hands as I hiked back to my vehicle. But I also felt something unexpected, unease about what came next. Publishing this evidence would bring attention to these mountains, to this Bigfoot population that had successfully remained hidden for centuries. Was that the right thing to do? Did I have an obligation to these creatures to protect their privacy? These questions would haunt me in the days to come. I returned to the cabin in a state of electric excitement mixed with growing concern. After backing up the footage to 3 separate hard drives stored in different locations, I began planning my next moves carefully. One video clip wouldn't be enough to overturn decades of scientific skepticism. I needed more documentation, more angles, more evidence establishing patterns of behavior and population dynamics. Over the following days, I pushed deeper into wilderness territory, deploying cameras in increasingly remote locations. The destroyed camera proved the Bigfoot were aware of surveillance, so I changed my tactics. I used better camouflage, more discreet mounting positions, natural cover to hide the devices. I placed them higher in trees, in positions that would be harder to notice from ground level. Strange phenomena began occurring with increasing frequency. In the evenings, I heard wood knocks echoing through the forest surrounding the cabin, not the random crack of falling branches or shifting deadfall. These were rhythmic, deliberate sounds. Knock, knock, pause, knock, 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 longer pause. Like a pattern of communication being transmitted across distances. I'd read about wood knocks in Bigfoot encounter reports, but dismissed them as embellishment or misidentification of natural sounds. Hearing them myself was entirely different. The pattern was too consistent, too regular to be coincidental. Something was using percussive sound to communicate, possibly coordinating movement or establishing territorial boundaries. One evening, as darkness fell, I decided to investigate the source. The knocking seemed to originate from a ridgeline above my position, maybe half a mile distant through dense forest. I grabbed a flashlight and began climbing toward the sounds, my heart pounding with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. The knocking continued as I climbed, always slightly ahead of me, leading me deeper into the woods. The pattern would repeat from one location, then fall silent. Minutes later, it would resume from a different direction, slightly farther away. I followed like someone in a trance, obsessed with finding the source. Then realization struck with cold clarity. I wasn't following the sounds. The Bigfoot had been shadowing me all along. I stopped climbing and looked around carefully, trying to spot any movement in the deepening shadows. That's when I saw it on the ridgeline about 200 yards away, silhouetted against the darkening sky. The Sasquatch stood completely motionless, just observing me. No attempt to hide, no visible concern about being spotted. The Bigfoot simply watched with that same calculating intelligence I'd seen in the camera footage. We stared at each other for what felt like several minutes, but was probably only seconds. My mind raced through options. Should I try to photograph it? Should I move closer? Should I retreat? Before I could decide, the Sasquatch turned and walked away, moving along the ridgeline with fluid grace. Within moments, it had disappeared into the forest so completely it might never have been there. No crashing through undergrowth, no obvious trail marking its passage. It simply melted into the shadows and vanished. I stumbled back to the cabin, my heart hammering, hands shaking with adrenaline. The encounter felt profoundly significant in ways I couldn't articulate. This wasn't a chance sighting or random crossing of paths. The Sasquatch had deliberately revealed itself, allowed me to see it clearly, then departed on its own terms. Why? What was the message? The next morning provided more evidence of constant observation. I found enormous footprints circling the cabin, pressed deep into the soft earth around the property. The Bigfoot had approached within 10 feet of the windows during the night while I slept. I followed the tracks around the perimeter, seeing where the Bigfoot had stopped to peer into various rooms, testing the structural integrity of the building, examining this strange human habitat. I was being watched continuously now. The roles had reversed. The researcher had become the research subject. The realization should have frightened me, but instead I felt strange exhilaration. This was contact, interaction, sophisticated behavior that suggested complex social intelligence and communication capabilities. My camera footage revealed even more remarkable discoveries. Multiple Bigfoot moving through the forest, at least 3 different individuals based on size variations and distinguishing features in their fur patterns. Some footage showed them watching cameras directly, as if posing for photographs or sending deliberate messages about their awareness. One particularly remarkable sequence captured what appeared to be a juvenile Sasquatch playing near a stream. The young Bigfoot splashed in the shallow water, investigated rocks, exhibited curiosity and exploratory behavior typical of young primates. The body language and movements were distinctly playful, suggesting childhood development and learning through environmental interaction. Then an adult Bigfoot appeared suddenly in frame and snatched the juvenile away with rough urgency. The adult had noticed the camera and immediately removed the younger Sasquatch from its view. The adult Bigfoot stared at the device for several seconds, clearly weighing whether to destroy it. Then it simply led the juvenile deeper into the forest, out of camera range. The message felt clear. I was tolerated but watched. The Bigfoot allowed me to document certain things while actively preventing documentation of others. They understood what cameras did and made strategic decisions about when to reveal themselves and when to remain hidden. I became obsessed with gathering more evidence. I stopped going to town for supplies, surviving on canned food and instant coffee. Sleep became irregular, just a few hours grabbed between reviewing footage and planning the next day's camera deployments. I covered the cabin windows at night, uncomfortable with Bigfoot watching me while I slept, though I knew they could still hear me moving around inside. My physical appearance deteriorated rapidly. I stopped shaving, barely bathed, wore the same clothes for days at a time. My focus narrowed to a single point, documenting these creatures comprehensively. Nothing else mattered. Not my health, not my dwindling supplies, not the increasing isolation. The scientific community would have to acknowledge this evidence. Years of ridicule would be vindicated. I would prove them all catastrophically wrong. I found particularly fresh tracks one morning during a routine camera check. The prints were still wet from overnight dew, edges crisp and sharp in the soft mud. These were the freshest signs I discovered since starting the investigation, probably left within the last few hours, maybe even while I was hiking to this location. Against my better judgment, I decided to follow them. I knew I was pushing boundaries, violating the implicit understanding that had developed between me and the Bigfoot. They tolerated my camera placements in exchange for my respect of certain limits. Following them directly crossed those limits. But the tracks were so fresh, the opportunity so compelling. I convinced myself this was necessary for the research. The trail led into dense forest where the canopy blocked most sunlight, creating perpetual twilight at ground level. The temperature dropped noticeably, maybe 10 degrees cooler than the surrounding areas. My breath became visible in the cold air. Multiple tree structures appeared as I pushed deeper, more elaborate than any I'd seen before. Branches woven into complex patterns, creating actual sheltered spaces large enough for bodies my size or bigger. Some structures were built against rock faces, using natural formations as backing walls, while woven branches provided roofing and windbreaks. Others stood free as elaborate frameworks that channeled air and water away from central areas. Bedding materials littered the ground inside the structures. Piled leaves, moss, and soft plant materials arranged to create insulation from cold ground. Some bedding looked recently disturbed, still showing body impressions. Scattered around were what appeared to be food remnants, stripped bark, nutshells, small animal bones picked clean. I realized with growing horror that I'd stumbled directly into their primary territory. This wasn't a temporary shelter or waypoint. This was a home base, a place where the Bigfoot family group rested, raised young, and conducted daily life. I'd violated the sanctity of their sanctuary. But scientific obsession overrode caution. I had to document this. I pulled out my camera and began photographing the structures, collected hair samples from the bedding areas, measured footprints in the soft earth. Every few seconds, I glanced around nervously, aware that I was being incredibly reckless. If the Bigfoot returned while I was here, the situation could turn dangerous very quickly. That's when I heard it. Branches breaking with explosive force, heavy footfalls pounding through the undergrowth like drum beats. Multiple sources surrounding me from different directions. I spun around to see a massive male Sasquatch charging directly toward my position. The Bigfoot was enormous, easily 9 feet tall, with shoulders so broad they barely fit between the trees. The fur was darker than the others I'd filmed, almost pure black with silver patches on the chest. Arms thick as tree trunks swung as the Sasquatch charged, each stride covering incredible distance. The expression was pure rage, lips pulled back showing large teeth, eyes narrowed with aggressive intent. This was a defender protecting its family's home from an intruder. The Bigfoot stopped 20 feet away, rising to full height in a dominance display that made my blood run cold. The Bigfoot's head reached well above the lower branches, towering over me like nothing I'd ever experienced. Then it began pounding its chest with closed fists, producing deep, hollow thuds that I felt reverberating through my ribcage like bass drum impacts. The Sasquatch released a roar that seemed to shake the forest itself. The sound was deafening, primal, terrifying beyond anything I'd experienced. It wasn't the roar of a bear or mountain lion. Those are threatening but recognizably animal. This was something else, a vocalization that conveyed intelligence, rage, and warning simultaneously. The roar echoed off trees and rock faces, seeming to come from every direction at once. I froze completely. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to flee this nightmare situation. But I knew with absolute certainty that running would be fatal. The Bigfoot could cover 20 feet in a fraction of a second. Running would trigger chase response, transform me from intruder to prey. So I stood paralyzed, not even breathing, while this massive creature demonstrated its physical dominance. The Sasquatch bent down and grabbed a rock the size of a cantaloupe. It hefted the stone casually, muscles rippling under dark fur. Then it hurled the rock past my head with tremendous force. The stone whistled through the air, smashed into a tree trunk 15 feet behind me with enough force to split bark and send splinters flying in all directions. This was a warning throw. The Bigfoot could have hit me easily at this distance. The accuracy and power were clearly demonstrated, but it chose not to. It was showing capability, issuing a threat, giving me one chance to leave before escalating to physical violence. Before I could react, movement caught my attention from the opposite direction. A second Bigfoot appeared, cutting off any retreat back the way I'd entered. This Sasquatch was slightly smaller but still massive, probably a female based on body proportions. The two creatures began vocalizing to each other in deep, whooping calls that carried through the forest. More calls answered from surrounding forest. 3, 4, maybe 5 or more Bigfoot hidden in dense undergrowth, closing in on the intruder who'd violated their sanctuary. I realized I was completely surrounded by an entire family group, all converging on this location to deal with the threat I represented. I slowly raised my hands, palms out, making myself look as non-threatening as possible. I avoided direct eye contact, keeping my gaze lowered in a submissive posture. I began backing away step by careful step, moving slowly toward what I hoped was the direction I'd entered from. My heart hammered so hard I thought it might burst. The Bigfoot allowed my retreat. They didn't advance but maintained their positions, creating a corridor I could walk through. I could feel their eyes tracking my every movement, calculating whether I represented continued threat or was complying with their demands to leave. The vocalizations continued, quieter now but still coordinating between multiple individuals. After I put about 100 yards between us, the immediate tension eased slightly. The aggressive vocalizations stopped, but they followed. I heard them moving through forest parallel to my path, staying just out of sight in the trees. They were escorting me out of their territory, ensuring I actually left and didn't circle back. I walked steadily for what felt like an eternity, every rustle and snap of branches sending fresh surges of adrenaline through my system. My legs shook with exhaustion and fear. Sweat poured down my face despite the cold air. I kept expecting them to charge, to decide the warning hadn't been sufficient. When I finally reached a logging road, cleared ground that marked the boundary between wilderness and human activity, the pursuit stopped abruptly. I looked back to see shadows moving between trees at the forest edge. The Sasquatch wouldn't follow onto open ground, wouldn't risk exposure in areas where humans might see them clearly. I'd reached safety. I ran the final mile back to my vehicle, driven by pure panic. My lungs burned, my legs felt like rubber, but I couldn't stop moving until I reached the SUV. My hands shook so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition. When the engine finally started, I felt a wave of relief so intense I nearly passed out. I'd survived an encounter that could easily have been fatal. I reached the cabin and immediately began barricading the door. The couch, kitchen table, chairs, everything I could move got piled against the entrance. I wedged the bedroom door shut with the dresser. Only then did the full reality of my situation hit me. I'd left my backpack in Bigfoot territory. The bag contained camera equipment worth thousands of dollars, my GPS unit, external storage drives with most of my documented footage. Everything I'd worked for over the past weeks was gone. That night was endless. I sat in the darkness with all lights off, listening to sounds outside the cabin. The wood knock started around midnight, rhythmic percussion that circled the building, coming from different directions in sequence. It sounded like the entire family group had moved closer to investigate me, to understand the human who'd violated their sanctuary. I heard heavy footsteps on the porch, impacts that made the wooden boards creak ominously, scratching sounds against the exterior walls like massive hands testing the structure's solidity. Something tried the door handle, rattling it against the barricade I constructed. The Sasquatch were examining the building, trying to understand this strange shelter, and the human inside who'd invaded their territory. At one point, tremendous pressure was applied to one of the windows. The glass flexed inward, groaning under stress, nearly at its breaking point. I heard breathing on the other side, deep, powerful inhalations and exhalations. A Bigfoot pressed against the window, trying to see inside, applying enough force to almost crack the glass. Then the pressure released and footsteps moved away. Dawn finally came after the longest night of my life. I'd spent hours sleepless, clutching a hunting knife that would be useless against creatures that size. When enough light filtered through the covered windows to see clearly, I carefully moved the barricade and opened the door with extreme caution. Footprints everywhere. Massive tracks circled the entire cabin multiple times, showing where the Sasquatch had walked around the structure repeatedly during the night. Different sizes indicated multiple individuals. The whole family group had come. Handprints marked the walls at various heights, some at normal human level, where the Bigfoot had pressed against the structure. Others reaching high above the windows, almost to the roof edge, showing the incredible height these creatures could reach when standing upright. One window had a crack running diagonally through the glass from the pressure applied during the night. I could see the outline of a palm print in the condensation that remained on the pane. The print was massive, easily covering most of the window, fingers splayed wide, each digit leaving a distinct mark. The Bigfoot had been trying to look inside, probably could see my silhouette even through the coverings I'd put up. Then I saw my backpack sitting on the porch steps. The Sasquatch had returned it during the night while I cowered inside. I approached cautiously, checking for any signs of immediate danger, then examined the bag carefully. The camera inside had been destroyed completely. Lens shattered into powder, housing crushed by incredible force. Internal electronics pulverized. All the memory cards were gone, not just removed, but extracted from their slots with such force that mounting clips were broken. The Bigfoot had systematically eliminated all evidence while returning the physical equipment. My GPS unit was similarly damaged, screen cracked, internal components crushed. Only items that couldn't store data remained intact. The implications staggered me. These creatures weren't just intelligent in general terms. They understood technology at a sophisticated level. They knew what cameras did, what memory cards contained, how data storage worked. They'd systematically removed evidence of their existence while returning equipment that no longer posed a threat. The act of returning the backpack felt almost taunting. They could have kept everything or destroyed it completely. Instead, they'd sent a clear message. We know exactly what you're doing. We control what evidence exists. We're allowing you to leave alive, but on our terms. This was psychological warfare from creatures displaying reasoning capabilities I hadn't anticipated. I decided to leave immediately. This had become too dangerous. I'd crossed lines that shouldn't be crossed, ventured into territory I had no right to enter. violated boundaries that had been clearly established. The Sasquatch family had shown remarkable restraint by allowing me to live when they could have easily killed me in that bedding area. I wouldn't test that mercy further. I packed only absolute essentials: clothes, remaining research materials, my laptop with the footage I'd backed up to the cabin's storage. Everything else could stay. The cameras still in the forest, the camping equipment, the supplies, none of it mattered anymore. I just wanted to get away from these mountains before the Bigfoot decided I'd overstayed my welcome. Before abandoning the cabin completely, I decided to check one final camera. It was the closest unit to the property, positioned at the forest edge to monitor any approach to the cabin. This was my last camera check, my last interaction with the research that had consumed me. The footage on that camera was extraordinary beyond anything I'd captured before. The memory card showed activity from throughout the previous night, the entire Bigfoot family group visible in multiple clips. 6 individuals total that I could identify. 2 large males, including the one who charged me, 1 female, and 3 juveniles of varying sizes and ages. The recordings captured them working together systematically, checking every camera I'd placed within a half-mile radius of the cabin during the night hours. They'd coordinated the operation with military precision. One Bigfoot would locate a camera and signal to others with specific vocalizations. They'd examine it briefly to confirm it was recording equipment, then disable it through various methods. Some cameras had batteries removed carefully, showing fine motor control and understanding of how the devices functioned. Others were destroyed violently, crushed, or thrown to eliminate the threat permanently. All had memory cards removed and taken away. The level of coordination and intelligence displayed was shocking. These weren't animals acting on instinct. This was planned group action toward a specific goal. The final clip showed the largest male Bigfoot approaching this particular camera. The Sasquatch stared directly into the lens, those deep-set eyes reflecting the infrared light with an eerie glow. The creature's expression was impossible to read. Was it anger, warning, curiosity? It reached up slowly and deliberately, the movement almost theatrical, and covered the lens with one massive hand. The screen went black, but audio continued recording. I heard deep breathing, the sound of air moving through large lungs. Then voice-like sounds began. Not quite words, not exactly language as humans understand it, but vocalizations that had structure, pattern, meaning. The Bigfoot was attempting communication or perhaps discussing the camera with others present. The sounds were complex and varied, far beyond simple animal calls, rising and falling tones, rhythmic patterns, pauses that suggested turn-taking in conversation. I could hear other Bigfoot respond in from different positions around the camera. They were having a discussion about this device, about me, about how to handle the situation. Then the recording cut off abruptly as the creature removed the memory card. But this particular camera model had a feature I'd forgotten about: dual storage. When the primary card was removed, an internal backup automatically activated, continuing to record to onboard memory. The Sasquatch hadn't known about the secondary storage. I had footage they'd specifically tried to delete. I downloaded the files immediately, my hands shaking with equal parts excitement and fear. This was incredible documentation of Bigfoot intelligence, family structure, coordinated behavior, and territorial defense. Combined with the earlier footage I'd backed up, I had evidence that would force the scientific community to completely reconsider everything they believed about primate evolution, North American wildlife, and the possibility of undiscovered species. I loaded my vehicle quickly, throwing bags into the back seat with no organization or care. Every few seconds I glanced toward the forest, expecting to see Bigfoot emerging. As I started the engine, wood knocks began again from the tree line. Slow, deliberate percussion that sounded different from previous nights. More aggressive, more insistent. I looked toward the forest and saw them. Shadows moving between trees, resolving into distinct shapes as they stepped into morning light. Multiple Bigfoot emerging into the open, walking upright toward the cabin. They weren't running or charging, just advancing steadily as a group with clear purpose. I didn't wait to discover their intentions. I floored the accelerator, gravel spraying from the tires as I raced down the mountain road. Branches scraped against the vehicle's sides. The road was barely maintained, and I took curves far too fast, nearly losing control multiple times. But fear drove me to take risks that should have been fatal. In the rearview mirror, I saw the Sasquatch standing in the middle of the road behind me. They'd stopped advancing and just watched me flee. The message was clear. They'd allowed me to leave. They could have prevented my escape easily, but they'd chosen to let me go. That mercy felt more terrifying than outright violence would have been. I returned to the logging town one final time, my hands still shaking from adrenaline and fear. I sat in the diner drinking coffee that had gone cold, trying to decide what to do with the evidence I'd gathered. Part of me wanted to report everything to official authorities. Maybe the sheriff, maybe park services, maybe wildlife management. But another part understood how insane it would all sound. A disgraced academic claiming he'd been stalked by a family of intelligent Sasquatch who'd destroyed his equipment and examined his cabin. Creatures that understood technology and coordinated group defense of their territory. Even with video evidence, skeptics would dismiss everything as elaborate hoaxes or misidentified bears. The scientific community that had already rejected me wouldn't suddenly reverse their position. I went to the sheriff's office anyway, more out of civic responsibility than any real hope of action. I filed a vague report about dangerous wildlife encounters, warning that people should avoid certain areas of the forest. The sheriff listened patiently with the expression of someone who'd heard similar stories before. Then he shared something that made my blood run cold. I wasn't the first person to investigate those particular areas. Others had tried over the years: cryptozoologists, adventure seekers, documentary filmmakers. Some had gone missing for days before stumbling out of the forest, refusing to discuss what they had experienced. Others had returned terrified, packed up immediately, and never came back to the region. A few had simply vanished completely, never found despite extensive search operations. The sheriff suggested I'd done the right thing by leaving when I did. Some things in these mountains should be left alone, he said. People who respected that boundary generally stayed safe. People who pushed too far sometimes didn't come back. He strongly advised me to forget about whatever I'd seen and move on with my life. I spent my last night in town reviewing the footage repeatedly. The images were clear and undeniable. A Bigfoot family group displaying intelligence, coordination, and sophisticated behavior far beyond simple animal instincts. They'd shown complex emotions: protectiveness toward juveniles, rage at territorial violation, calculated restraint in their response, even mercy by allowing me to escape alive. The footage documented genuine family structures and social organization. Adults protecting young, coordinated group activities requiring communication and planning, division of labor during the systematic camera destruction. These weren't mindless forest apes surviving on instinct. They were thinking beings with culture, strategy, social organization, and sophisticated understanding of their environment and threats within it. I realized I couldn't share these findings with the scientific community. Not because I lacked sufficient evidence, the documentation was comprehensive and compelling, but because publishing it would be a fundamental betrayal of the trust these creatures had shown. They deliberately controlled what evidence survived my investigation. They destroyed most cameras and footage while allowing a few recordings to survive. Perhaps they'd known I'd back up the files, perhaps they simply didn't care about isolated clips. Either way, they demonstrated their ability and willingness to control information about their existence. These Sasquatch were successfully protecting themselves from human discovery. They'd lived in these mountains for generations, possibly centuries or longer, staying hidden despite increasing human activity. They understood surveillance technology, knew how to defeat it, and made calculated decisions about when to reveal themselves and when to remain concealed. This was active protection of their species through strategic intelligence. Publishing my findings would betray that strategy. It would bring researchers flooding into the area, disrupting the careful balance these creatures had maintained. Camera crews, scientists, thrill seekers, all descending on this remote territory. The Bigfoot would be forced to relocate or risk constant human interaction. Their peaceful existence would be destroyed. They'd shown me intelligence and remarkable restraint. They'd allowed me to document their existence, then allowed me to leave alive despite my violation of their sanctuary. They'd sent clear messages about boundaries while exercising mercy. I owed them discretion and protection in return. Some discoveries shouldn't be shared with the world. Some mysteries serve a purpose by remaining mysterious. Maybe some species have an inherent right to remain hidden. They'd survived this long by staying out of human awareness, by controlling evidence of their existence, by making strategic decisions about contact. Who was I to destroy that with my need for professional vindication? My career was already gone. Destroying their privacy wouldn't restore what I'd lost. I drove home with the footage safely encrypted on multiple storage devices. I'd keep it private, perhaps share it with a few trusted individuals who would understand the implications and ethical considerations. But I wouldn't seek publication or recognition. The personal cost would be accepting that my academic career was truly finished. The ethical cost of publishing would be far worse. I still examine the clearest photographs sometimes late at night. The image of that massive male Bigfoot staring directly into the camera before covering the lens. Those eyes show unmistakable intelligence, awareness, calculation, and warning. A thinking being who understood exactly what was happening and made conscious choices about how to respond. Not an animal, a person of a different species entirely. I wonder if the Sasquatch family still lives in those mountains. I wonder if they remember the human who invaded their territory and whether they discuss me during their communications. I wonder if they're still out there, watching from the forest edge whenever humans venture too close, making sure we don't discover the truth about what lives in those ancient forests. Sometimes I'm tempted to return, to try making peaceful contact, to approach with respect rather than cameras and scientific observation. But that feels like it would be another violation. They'd made their position absolutely clear. They would tolerate humans at a distance, in limited contexts, with clear boundaries. Respect those boundaries and survive. Cross them and face consequences. The scientific community continues dismissing Bigfoot as folklore and campfire stories. They're welcome to their skepticism. I know what I saw, what I documented, what I experienced in those mountains. The creatures I encountered were real, intelligent, sophisticated, and deserving of protection through continued obscurity. Maybe that's the greatest gift I can give them. Looking at that photograph one final time before closing the encrypted file, I see a face that's undeniably primate yet distinctly unique. Not quite ape in the way gorillas or chimpanzees are apes, not quite human despite the intelligence visible in those eyes. Something evolution produced independently in North American wilderness. A species that learned to coexist with expanding human civilization by mastering the art of remaining unseen. Maybe that's exactly how it should remain. Maybe the greatest contribution I can make to cryptozoology is protecting these creatures through silence rather than exposing them through publication. They showed me their existence, demonstrated their intelligence, then allowed me to walk away alive. That was an extraordinary gift, perhaps the most significant scientific discovery I could ever make. Keeping their secret feels like the only ethical response to that profound trust. The world isn't ready for this discovery. Human nature being what it is, confirmation of Bigfoot existence would trigger exploitation rather than protection. Research stations, tourist operations, hunting expeditions by people who view intelligent life as trophies. The Sasquatch would go from hidden inhabitants to endangered species within a generation. So I closed the files and strengthened the encryption. Someday, perhaps decades from now, when I'm old and near the end of my life, maybe the world will have evolved enough to handle this revelation responsibly. Maybe society will have developed sufficient respect for non-human intelligence to treat this discovery with the reverence it deserves. But that day hasn't arrived yet, and I won't be the person who triggers their extinction through premature disclosure. Until then, the Sasquatch remain safely hidden in their mountains, protected by the very mystery that once drove me to seek them. They continue their lives undisturbed, raising their young, maintaining their family structures, watching human activity from safe distances. And I remain silent, carrying both the burden and the privilege of knowing they exist, while honoring their fundamental right to remain undiscovered by a species that isn't ready to treat them as equals rather than curiosities. For more interesting stories, check this out.